Welcome, everyone. I'm Virginia Kotz. I'm an editor-in-chief and producer at Real Progressives. Now I'm going to introduce Andy Kennedy, our media director, podcast editor, and producer, and a bunch of other things. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Virginia. And you tonight are in for a macroeconomic treat. We have with us a absolute wonderful person and one of the best friends of Real Progressives that you could possibly imagine. Dr. Professor Fadhel Kaboub got his bachelor's degree in economics at the University of Tunis, and then he traveled to the United States and got his master's and his PhD at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. After teaching at a number of different universities in the United States, he took his current position as Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University in 2008. Now, the reason that we found it was really important to have Fadhel on with us for this NOC is the initiative that he's brought forward with himself and a bunch of fellow economists from the global south and from different other parts of the world. And it's all started from a monetary sovereignty conference last year in November. And they just recently released an open letter called Africa's Pandemic Response Calls for Reclaiming Economic and Monetary Sovereignty. One of the things that I find very interesting and about Fadhel Kaboub is that there seems to be a very well-defined line between the academic and the activism side of the people that work to spread the word of MMT. And I would say that he is probably the one and only that can move seamlessly in both worlds. I've heard him say a number of times that he is at least as comfortable in his activist RP t-shirt as he is in his academic suit and tie. So that makes a very unique person. And he is such a amazing person to be that we can call a friend of our section of the movement. Very, very valuable friend. And to end my introduction, I just wanted to let you know of a conversation that I had with Professor Forstater earlier in the year. And he said to me in that conversation, and I quote, "One of the best things I ever did in my life was to ask Fadhel to be the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity." And, you know, I just think that that's the most appropriate compliment that that Fadhel could get, especially from his peers. And to channel Steve, who unfortunately couldn't be here, without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Dr./Professor Fadhel Kaboub.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for the generous introduction and for the kind words. It's a pleasure to be here with the Real Progressives family and friends. And thank you again for being the editor-in-chief for the audio files for the open letter that we released last week on the website of Africa's Monetary and Economic Sovereignty website, which the viewers will get a link to later. It's a pleasure to be here. So I wanted to, open up by saying a few words about this open letter, and I think John has the slides. We can start with the very first slide, which has the link to the website. where this open letter is available in more than 50 languages. I want to send my well wishes to our website manager, who is under the weather, possibly COVID related, but he's feeling a little better. So if you've noticed, the website doesn't have the audio files yet, but it has most of the translations, and we've been overwhelmed with the number of emails and notes of support from people all over the world who signed the open letter and are asking how they can be involved in what we hope to be a movement, a global movement. So far, we have more than 650 people who signed it from all over the world, not just academics, but activists and organizers and policymakers from Africa, the diaspora, and beyond, from the global south. And since we're here with friends, you'll notice the logo for the conference is here on display. And just for fun, when you have a moment, look up the logo online. You'll find it on our Twitter handle. And if you find the MMT secret code on this logo, tag us on social media and tell us what it is. So just for fun. And I know many of you already know what it is because you're insiders, so you know what the secret codes are and the secret handshakes are. So it's in there. And I want to thank my colleagues, co-conspirators in this effort, Ndongo Samba Sila from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Dakar in Senegal, and my two colleagues from Tunis, Maha Ben Gadha and Ines Mahmoud, and our colleague from Germany, Kai Kodemruk, who helped organize the conference, are helping also in producing the book that will be coming out next year from this conference, and planning the next conference in Dakar, hopefully 2021, once the pandemic is under control, hopefully. And have been my colleagues in producing this letter and building this effort. And thank you again to Real Progressives, Macro and Cheese, for producing a podcast last week, I believe, covering the open letter and sort of discussing some of the themes that we'll be discussing today. So check out the website, follow us on Twitter, and circulate the letter to as many people as you can, to get us more people involved in this movement, because we didn't want this open letter to be sent to policymakers or just academics. We want them to be involved in this conversation about shifting the policy framework away from the mainstream Washington consensus austerity-driven paradigm to an MMT paradigm, to a paradigm that focused on monetary sovereignty, economic sovereignty, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, focusing on sustainability and renewable energy in particular. So we wanted the average person to be involved in this discourse, because the average person has been told there is no alternative. And unfortunately, after decades of saying there is no alternative, the general public more or less has been convinced that we're just doomed and we're supposed to suffer the scarcity of resources and the scarcity of money, and have to make sacrifices. And MMT essentially saying it doesn't have to be that way. There is an alternative, and we're trying to open that discourse and conversation to educate, inspire, organize, and mobilize people to demand an alternative policy framework. And it's not going to be done from the top down. I believe it has to be done from the bottom up, with the Global South movement that we're hoping to be involved with. So that being said, I'd love to move on to the next slide, John, if you're able to. And I was asked to talk about the Global Green New Deal framework that I started presenting and discussing in different contexts over the last less than a year, I suppose. This semester at Denison, I'm actually teaching a seminar called the Global Green New Deal. And in that framework that I'm sketching, I talk about climate reparations, that is reparations for climate change, for climate damage, and reparations for colonialism. And this idea really started a couple of years ago when we began in the US this big push for the Green New Deal in the US. And, we're all excited about, the possibilities and the fact that this is finally, on the table, that we're waking up to the reality that climate change is a serious threat, and that inequality and climate change are these dual challenges that we have to deal with in the US, and that time is of the essence. We really have 10 years to take really bold transformative action in the context of the US. So the Green New Deal, as many of you are familiar with, the framework is to address both climate change, to decarbonize the economy, and to address inequality, structural inequality. And then naturally you start thinking about it. Well, climate change is not a US problem exclusively, it's a global issue. And inequality is also a global issue. So we can't really, move the needle, so to speak, if we're just successful at putting forward a US Green New Deal. Even if you add Canada and you add Japan and you add most of the industrialized world, we're still not going to put a dent in this thing called climate change and global inequality, unless we have a comprehensive, coherent global framework for something that would be called the global Green New Deal. So then you start thinking about it from an MMT perspective. MMT says that, sovereign governments have a fiscal spending capacity or fiscal policy space that can be large or can be small, depending on how much monetary sovereignty that particular country enjoys. So maybe this is helpful here to do a quick definition of that fiscal spending space. So the mainstream of the profession, they tell us that the fiscal spending space is very limited for sovereign government. It's limited by tax revenues and borrowing capacity. And MMT says, no, it's not. It says that spending capacity, the fiscal policy space, is actually much, much larger for most countries. It's not unlimited. It's constrained by the real resource constraint. It's constrained by the risk of inflation. And to me, the risk of inflation comes in two forms. One is a potential shortage of productive capacity. That is when we run out of equipment and physical resources and technology and skilled people to produce things, then we start seeing inflation. The good thing about that kind of inflation is that resources are producible. So we can train more people, we can build more equipment, we can build more infrastructure if we have a strategic plan to increase our productive capacity. So that's sort of the easy part. The challenging part is the other risk of inflation, which comes from excessive or abusive pricing and market power in particular industries. Think of the US health insurance industry or oil companies or energy companies in general. So those are industries that can raise prices and cause inflation simply because they can, or in other words, simply because we let them, because they're not regulated enough. And that kind of inflation risk can't be mitigated by austerity, which is what the mainstream tells us and what policymakers usually say. But that risk of inflation, you can only get rid of it by taxing and regulating market power out of existence, or by democratizing and making those markets more competitive. So now we have different countries around the world with different degrees or different levels of fiscal spending capacity. Typically, countries like the US, Japan, the UK, Australia, Canada, and so on have a much larger fiscal spending capacity because they have lots of productive resources and they have the capability of taxing and regulating market power out of existence, democratizing market power. Because the democratic forces are there, they're just not activated in the right direction. We use democratic forces to get out the vote, to tell people that you should participate in elections, that we should have freedom of speech, and all those things are great. But if we don't use the democratic institutions to tackle the oligarchical forces within the US system, within the global north, then we're not really, fully utilizing the potential of democratic institutions. And as a result, we're sacrificing quality of life, and we're really losing this battle when it comes to climate change in particular, and global inequality. So now we have countries like the US and Canada and Japan who can do this and should do massive, transformative Green New Deals, not just today, but 20, 30 years ago should have started, right? But then what about the global south? Countries with limited productive capacity, countries with limited fiscal spending space. How can we make sure that we have a transformative global Green New Deal in which all countries are participating in mitigating climate change and undoing some of the structural inequality issues? And it turns out most developing countries can't really undo the structural global inequality issues because they've been imposed from abroad for decades and hundreds of years in some cases. So with that, I'd like to go to the next slide just to illustrate with one particular point, and I call this neocolonial net wealth extraction. So people are familiar with colonialism. We don't have to spend time there to tell you what the purpose of colonialism was. It was extracting resources. It was abusive. It was brutal. It was violent. The record is there. Nobody can deny it. I mean, I guess some people can deny it. Try to deny it at least. But I want to focus on this piece, which is this. If you focus on the green line, I believe, which is the net resource transfers. So if you take the entire world and divide it into rich countries and poor countries, so global south and global north, and you take into account all the financial transactions, exports, imports, foreign direct investment, interest payment, charity, contributions to the global south, debt cancellation, interest payments, all of these transactions, and you net the total amount, it turns out that the global south, the poorest countries, are systematically sending money to the global north. So there's a net extraction of wealth from the global south. And notice the green line was sort of steady at, a few $1 billion a year. And then starting in the 2000s started to really accelerate. When I was in grad school, this is where I was in grad school, it was around $500 billion almost 20 years ago. And now we're looking at $2 trillion a year being extracted from the global south to the global north. So if we're dreaming about a better world in which we can address climate change, we can address global inequality, but we're not doing anything about this dynamic, then we're just being foolish. We'll never get to an equitable, global system or a global system where developing countries can actually handle a pandemic or can, provide a decent quality of life for their people if they're collectively losing $2 trillion a year. And if we're not doing anything structural to address this dynamic, then in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years, we'll be looking at this picture and the numbers will be in the 10 trillion, 20 trillion, who knows, because this is increasing. The trend is increasing. It's not going to reverse naturally by itself. So we need some global agreement to undo this dynamic and to start producing a dynamic that actually shifts resources, financial resources and technological resources from the global north to the global south. And when I started thinking about that, it makes sense to make the case for reparations for climate damage, reparations for the ecological damage and displacement of indigenous communities through mining, especially for resources that fueled economic development in the global north and fueled CO2 emissions and consumerism in the global north. But also reparations for colonialism, which is obviously, you can't really put a dollar amount on it. We can sort of put a dollar amount on this period, the neocolonial period, because we have the finances and we know what's happening. But the amount is massive, right? So if we go to the next picture, oh, it looks like I can move the slides from here. Oh, nice. Okay. Yeah, that's nice. I can move the pictures from here. Thank you, John. So the next picture here, and I don't have a lot of slides here. I just want to show you just a few pieces of information just to start a conversation. Inequality. It's not a U.S. thing. It's a global thing. This is global income distribution in terms of, you're looking at the top 10% there, accumulating, a massive amount of wealth. 52% of global income goes to the top 10%. The next, 10%, the next percentile in terms of the wealthiest, they receive another 19%. And when you look at the poorest 50% of the population globally, they collectively receive about 8% of global income. And the trend has been accelerating in the wrong direction year after year after year. So we have all of these trends that are extracting wealth and making life more miserable and more difficult in the global south. That's unsustainable economically, politically, socially, ethically, you name it. All of these trends are unsustainable. The next picture, we're looking at percentage of CO2 emission by world population. So it's almost like a mirror image of what we were looking at earlier in terms of global inequality. Global inequality is also reflected in terms of who's consuming or who's emitting most CO2 emissions. And again, it's the wealthiest population that's responsible for most of the damage, right? So now we're sort of laying out a framework in which we're identifying who's responsible for most climate damage. And as a result, we can point to who should be responsible for reparations, for monetary compensation, for transfer of technology to repair that damage. The next picture, we'll look at CO2 emissions by country. And notice here, it's the usual suspects, but we also have newcomers. We have China and India. So I wouldn't make the claim that China or India today are as responsible as the UK or the US or Japan, but they're getting up there. So they're China, India, Brazil are sort of the newcomers in this space. So responsible, but not as much as countries that have been, doing this kind of CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolution, essentially. So it's important to look at the carbon footprint of countries, not in terms of what they emit in the process of producing domestically, but in terms of what they consume. Because we in the US consume a lot of CO2 footprint that's actually produced in China, in India, and Mexico. So we should take responsibility for what we're consuming, even though it's produced and is emitting CO2 in other parts of the world. So that gives us a better picture in terms of trying to map out who's responsible for the damage, and as a result, who should be paying a larger share of the reparations. And once you start doing that, you realize that it almost maps out one-to-one in terms of global south and global north. You recognize that countries that actually have the largest fiscal spending capacity, like the US, like Canada, like South Korea, like Japan and Germany. Germany is a special case because of the EU, but we can fix that, right? If we get the ECB to act like the actual sovereign for the region, then the Eurozone and European Union in general has a lot of fiscal spending capacity. It's just being suffocated right now by the Maastricht Treaty rules. So we map out all of these countries that happen to have the largest fiscal spending capacity today to introduce their own Green New Deals. They also happen to be the most technologically advanced countries that can actually transfer technology to countries that have the least amount of fiscal policy space, and countries that are on the front lines of the negative effects of climate change. Then we sort of have a framework in place for putting together a global Green New Deal in which the global north, which has the largest fiscal spending capacity and technological capabilities, and happens to be responsible for a lot of the colonial damage, responsible for the neocolonial extraction of wealth from the global south, and responsible for most CO2 emissions and climate damage. Then we have a framework to work with. And I'm obviously not naive, but I don't think that the US or Canada will wake up tomorrow and say, well, yeah, we need to pay reparations. We need to build a movement for this. And I'm not really bringing anything new with this data or with any of these ideas. I'm just trying to put them together in a sort of MMT coherent way and hope to make the legal case, the economic case, the ethical case, that we have to fix this. Otherwise, that the whole system will implode. This is not sustainable on the climate front and the inequality front, on politically and socially. These things are not sustainable. And then the next picture I have here, and I only have one or two more, I think, to show you here. This is the cumulative CO2 emissions. Notice that this is forecasting for the next 60 years or so. The forecast is that China, at this current rate, will continue to increase exponentially and will become the largest emitter of CO2, in a cumulative way. But at this point, it's the United States by far, followed by Europe, followed by Japan. India is not there yet, but it's going to pick up eventually. But even then, it's not going to exceed Europe, for example. So we know which countries are on which trend here. The global South doesn't even appear on the CO2 emissions, map, which means the global South collectively, with the exception of China and India, as I said, we can talk about those separately. The global South must be the recipient of monetary compensation for climate damage, monetary compensation for colonialism, that includes India, by the way. And when we talk about reparations, and this is not my idea about reparations, when we talk about reparations, we usually talk about 3 steps in a process. One is, telling the truth, recognizing that a harm has been done. And usually there's something called, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, like the one in South Africa or even Canada, or after major genocides, where a nation as a whole comes together and essentially tells the truth about what happened. It's a process of trying to heal together and move on as a nation. It's not a court system where you're trying to send somebody to prison at the end of the process. So number one, telling the truth about what happened in terms of climate damage, in terms of colonial pain that was imposed on developing countries. And once you tell the truth, it makes perfect sense to offer a public apology for the harm that was done. So that's step number 2 in the process. And once you have a public apology and an acknowledgement of responsibility and the harm that was done, then it makes perfect sense to try your best, to repair the damage, to make the situation better. That you can't bring back, people who died. You can't, undo. You can't go back in history and undo, historical events and undo, but you can try to do your best to at least make sure that the same scenarios that happened in the past are not reproduced. And we collectively try to make the situation better. So reparations is not just a monetary compensation. There needs to be monetary compensation that will help developing countries proceed with an aggressive Green New Deal program in different parts of the world. That monetary compensation must, start by debt cancellation to begin with, for the global South, external debt cancellation. That's a no-brainer. That's step number 1. But also reparations must include transfer of technology, research and development cooperation, so that you start building the domestic institutions and infrastructure that will sustain a global Green New Deal framework beyond the initial phase of reparations. And that will help accelerate the implementation of food sovereignty programs, energy sovereignty programs, especially renewable energy and decarbonization programs, but also building the new infrastructure that is absolutely necessary to mitigate the negative effects of climate change. Because, let's be realistic here. We're really not talking about undoing climate change. I think that ship has sailed. We have to wake up to that reality. The best we can hope for, as of right now, given the technology we have and the resources we have, the best we can have is to slow down the speed at which climate change is happening, and to build capabilities to become more resilient, to mitigate the negative effects of climate change. And maybe with some, good luck and lots of research and development, maybe we'll figure out a way to extract green gas houses from the atmosphere and store them away somehow or recycle them somehow, but we're not even close. We don't even have the technological capabilities, which, by the way, means massive commitment to research and development to figure out a long-term solution. But as of right now, the best we can hope for is mitigation. There's no going back to cleaner air and things of that nature. And then finally, one thing that we need to recognize here, because the financial industry globally is finally waking up to this reality. At least publicly, we've seen some statements and some documents that have been leaked to refer to these themes that all of us should be familiar with now. These should not be secret terms of trade. Something called the carbon bubble and something called stranded assets. So think of, most people are familiar with the stock market bubble, right? Where assets are overinflated and nobody's paying attention, or all of a sudden that information is revealed and we have a market crash because people are selling those assets, and you end up with a stock market crash because those assets are now going back to their fundamental real value as opposed to the inflated value. Well, think of real estate properties in the U.S. in coastal cities, right? All the hotels and resorts and fancy properties on the beach and so on. All of those things have real monetary value, right? But with the impact of climate change, hurricanes, flooding, sea level rising, those property will be underwater, literally underwater, in a few decades, which means the monetary value of a building underwater is going from, $2 million to zero, right? So that particular asset, physical asset, is called a stranded asset because it's not going to be used for anything, right? So you're going to lose that value. So here we have, in the US alone, $1 trillion worth of stranded real estate assets in coastal cities in the US. So now add to this global coastal cities with all the resorts and hotels and entertainment centers and so on. Think of the monetary value of assets that are there today that will not be available to create jobs or to, so that's part of the bubble. Oil and gas assets, physical, infrastructure that oil and gas companies have built, those will be also stranded assets, right? Which means, with the impact of climate change, with hopefully transition to more renewable energy, all of those assets will be useless, right? And it's estimated that we're talking about $1 to $4 trillion, depending on the study, depending what you include and what you exclude. But this is significant. But overall, Bill McKibben, in one of his articles a few years ago, sort of put together a number, and it's at least $20 trillion, if not $30 trillion worth of this carbon bubble. And if we're taking this seriously, this is the biggest financial market crash in the history of the universe waiting to happen. And it's happening in slow motion with the impact of climate change, but it looks like these things are accelerating. So now your responsibility as a fund manager, as an endowment manager to your clients, is to invest their retirement money, for example, in markets and industries that generate returns, right? And you need to do your homework, your due diligence, so you don't place my retirement money in a hotel chain that has most of its properties in coastal cities in the US that will be worth nothing in 20 years or 30 years, right? So now it's your responsibility to move financial investments away from risky investments, and here climate risky investment, and into safer investments. So we can bring, at least using the tools of financial markets and financial analysis, to move investments away from what would be stranded assets and to move into the new economy, renewable investment and more resilient. And as an industry, you need to be putting pressure on governments to put in place policies to mitigate the risks of this carbon bubble. So that's kind of leaning on the financial industry to do the right thing. I'm not naive that they'll wake up tomorrow and support a global Green New Deal or anything like this. But internally within the industry, we see serious concerns about this. If you're an insurance company and insuring these properties, you're taking a huge risk, right? So the financial industry is waking up to this reality. So now, what kind of global Green New Deal? Can we afford it? Who's going to pay for it? These are the usual questions that are laid on the table. So as I said earlier, we have an MMT lens that allows us to assess how we pay for things at the national level when we talk about sovereign governments. Developing countries don't have the same level of economic and monetary sovereignty as a country like the US or Japan. So the fiscal spending capacity is much smaller. As a result, if we're really trying to do this in the next 10 years and really push hard on mitigating the impacts of climate change and global inequality, we have to do this quickly in a coherent way, where countries that have the largest fiscal spending capacity, who happen to be responsible for colonial and climate damage, need to be, footing the bill, essentially, under a global Green New Deal framework, not just financially, but in terms of transfer of technology and transfer of resources, so that the global South can be part of a coherent framework, so that we undo that $2 trillion a year that's being extracted from the global South to the global North. That needs to reverse immediately in the opposite direction. Otherwise, we're really, spinning our wheels, and we're not going to save the planet or address global inequality or mitigate these risks on the climate front, on the social and political front. I looked everywhere, tried to see if there's any meaningful proposal that really gets us a bold and aggressive global Green New Deal framework. And, without the MMT lens, and I think without the reparations argument, I don't think the MMT lens is sufficient, without the reparations argument for colonial debt, for climate debt, and for post-colonial debt, this extractive, framework that we have here, we're really, there's nothing other than, we'll do a Green New Deal here in the US, and we'll invest a lot in renewable energy, and we'll sell some, solar technology or wind technology to the global South at a discount, or we'll lend them money, or we'll help them, here and there, but we're not going to cancel their debt. We're not going to undo the dynamic that sucks $2 trillion a year from those countries. To me, that's just a waste of time to think that we can address these global issues by having a very timid and kind of small and incremental approach to these urgent problems. And I'll close with a quote that you've probably heard me say a few times from Martin Luther King in the context of the civil rights movement, that I think applies here, where he says, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drug of gradualism and incrementalism." Right? We need bold policy action, transformative policy action, because anything that's not radical, that doesn't go to the roots of the problem to undo these dynamics, anything that's not radical is by definition superficial. If it doesn't go to the roots, it's working at the surface. And superficial means status quo. Superficial is not something that we should be looking forward to. So with that, I'm happy to take questions. I'll stop here.